Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm Patty Dillon, Senior Director of Criteria and Category Development at the Global Electronics Council. Today, GEC is really excited to share an overview of our criteria development process for the EPEAT program and why we're undertaking these changes. We're really pleased that we have over 100 stakeholders today from around the globe joining our webinar. Now, before I introduce my colleagues who'll be presenting alongside of me today, just a few housekeeping items. First, all participants are on mute to reduce background noise. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website in the next few days. Please feel free to share this broadly with your colleagues. At the end of the presentation, we look forward to answering your questions. We encourage you to submit questions by typing them into the questions window in GoToWebinar. We'll get to as many questions as we can, and if we don't have time to respond to all your questions, we will follow up after the call by email. Now, joining me today are Nancy Gillis, CEO of the Global Electronics Council. Nancy will start the webinar off with a brief review of GEC's mission and objectives, which will set the stage for why we are modifying our criteria development process. I will then provide an overview of GEC's dynamic criteria development process, what we are trying to achieve through the process, and an overview of the key steps in the process. I'll also provide a timeline and schedule for both the criteria development and implementation in EPEAT, and most importantly, how stakeholders can engage in the process. Now, I'm really pleased to have our valued and long-term partner organization, NSF International, on today's call. Jess Evans, the Director of Standards Development at NSF International. She'll provide an overview of NSF's role and in the process for executing the voluntary consensus for EPEAT criteria development. With that, let's begin. Nancy, will you kick us off?
Yes, thank you very much, Patty, and welcome, Jess. I have been looking forward to this webinar because it's actually an outcome of multiple years of work, both within the Global Electronics Council and, of course, in partnership with NSF International, to focus on a new way for us to develop and maintain the criteria that are at the heart of the EPEAT Ecolabel. But let's step back for a moment. Now, as Patty said, there are a large number of participants in this webinar, and many of you may still be unaware we are now the Global Electronics Council. So let me first start by saying that we were known as the Green Electronics Council. We're now known as the Global Electronics Council, and that change actually is relevant to our discussion today because we made that change to recognize that prior, being the Green Electronics Council, it seemed to be that we weren't addressing the social aspects of sustainability. Well, we are, and you'll hear a little bit about that not only today, but of course as we continue our work. Additionally, we are now the Global Electronics Council in a reflection of the impact that we're increasingly having. The Global Electronics Council, as it says here, we're a mission-driven nonprofit. And when we step back, what our mission is to create a more just and sustainable world. And that really is one in which you need to now have impact at scale. And that type of impact we seek to achieve through three mission focus areas. One, we seek to educate stakeholders on the environmental and social impacts of technology, because of course we are supporting purchasers in the technology space. And part of what you'll hear about today is really how the criteria that we have under EPEAT not only need to be impactful, but also need to educate the stakeholders on what the true impacts of their purchasing decisions are. Also, we are a mission-driven organization, which is another way of saying that we do advocate for a point of view. And that point of view is one in which we leverage purchasing power to make sure that we're actually creating a world that improves the health and the environment and the quality of life for people everywhere. And so what we hear about today is part of our new way of looking at criteria development and maintenance is really making sure that we're fulfilling that advocacy promise, that we're really having an impact with our criteria. And as I was so excited to acknowledge, we of course are joined on this webinar by a representative from NSF International. And that's really part and parcel of our focus on collaboration. The challenges that we face globally in addressing the environmental and social impacts of technology are ones that we can't address alone. And so the Global Electronics Council strongly emphasizes working collaboratively together with public and private sector organizations and really harnessing each of our respective focus and energies to meet the goal that we all do or should have, which is to create that more just and sustainable world. So we're excited to be joined by NSF International and to talk a little bit about what our collaboration with them as it pertains to criteria development and maintenance looks like. So with that, I welcome all of you. I welcome this conversation, and I look forward to the information that we'll be sharing with you. That, let me turn it back to you, Patty.
Great. Thank you so much, Nancy, for that introduction. So before we dive into the process, I want to just give a little more sort of background on why we're revising our criteria development process. And there are three main reasons as shown here, and Nancy alluded to some of them. One is first, impact, efficiency, and global applicability. So as far as impact goes, as all of you know, EPEAT is a tool for purchasers to identify and drive the availability of more sustainable products. So it's really important that we ensure relevance of criteria in meeting the objectives of purchasers so they have an impact with their purchasing dollars. We also want to have an impact at scale. Since EPEAT launched over a dozen years ago, our knowledge of sustainability impacts has matured. There's more data and information available on impacts and reduction strategies. So it's really important that we harness science and evidence to drive change and focus on what matters. This process is also intended to be more dynamic and expedient, to more iterative, to better accommodate a changing landscape in science and technology and through continuous improvement. Now, secondly, efficiency. So GEC has years of experience with criteria development, and we've had our challenges, we can say, such as standards that have taken 3 to 5 years to complete, and the ability to engage a diverse group of stakeholders in the process. And in part, it's due to the length of the process, but also a bit of a mismatch between the broad range of topics that we cover in our categories compared to the more focused expertise of many stakeholders. Our new process is intended to create a more efficient, focused criteria development process that we really hope will broaden stakeholder engagement. Now, the approach to criteria development, and specifically the harmonization of criteria across EPEAT product categories, is aimed at creating efficiencies as well in conformity assessment for manufacturers, conformity assurance bodies, or CABs as we call them, as well as the EPEAT program itself. Now, at GEC and the various venues, we participate in activities globally. And in those activities that we engage in, we hear from manufacturers, purchasers, and government policy about the need for criteria harmonization. And that voice is growing louder and louder. And so harmonization within the EPEAT program across our product categories is a first step and an important goal for GEC moving forward. And then global applicability is our third goal. Now, over the years, the use of EPEAT by large-scale public purchasers has extended beyond the US federal and state governments to other countries, most notably the European Union. We also see traction in South and Central America and India. Our new process meets both the US purchaser requirements for voluntary consensus and the preference in the EU and other countries for a type 1 ecolabel. And so our process meets the objectives of both of all the purchasers that are looking at any of those type of requirements. So now we'll go into the dynamic criteria development process at GEC and its core elements. So the first core element of our dynamic criteria development process is a state of sustainability research report, which compiles and evaluates available science and data to identify life cycle, environmental and social impacts or hotspots of the technology. The state of sustainability research also looks at these impacts within the context of purchaser and government policy priorities. It identifies strategies or actions that can be taken throughout the life cycle of the product or technology to reduce significant and priority impacts. And finally, and of critical importance, the state of sustainability research identifies opportunities to harmonize, you'll hear this word over and over in our remarks today, harmonize with existing standards, best practices and criteria, both within and external to the EPEAT program. Now, the middle box is the second core element of our dynamic criteria development process, and it's using voluntary consensus to develop criteria. EPEAT, we have a deep history in the use of voluntary consensus for criteria development, and it's a principle that we are very committed to. We believe that the engagement of stakeholders in criteria development strengthens the technical quality as well as the applicability and the achievability of the resulting criteria. So we're committed to voluntary consensus. Now, within the voluntary consensus process, there's a few key characteristics for criteria. Now, we want to make sure that our criteria focus on priority sustainability impacts, and we'll be identifying those in the state of sustainability research. Now, what this might mean is that going forward, we might find that some criteria that we have in our existing program might not be impactful. So let's not spend resources on criteria that don't move the sustainability needle. That might happen. Now, we also seek to develop modular criteria that can be applied across all categories where possible, which will create the efficiency and harmonization across the categories, as I said before. Now, we also think that as EPEAT has done in the past, it's important to continue to provide flexibility to encourage innovation. Now, that might be through optional points or innovation criteria, but to provide some flexibility. But at the same time, we also want to make sure that EPEAT products meet a minimum set of criteria that address priority impacts. So purchasers know that what they're buying, any product that they buy that has the EPEAT logo, they are buying a credible, sustainable product. So some minimum requirements. And then the third core element of our process, as shown on the left, is continuous maintenance. And this is to ensure that criteria are relevant, continue to be impactful, and recognize change in technology, science, and best practices. So that's the overview of the dynamic criteria process. Many of you have seen this before. We've been talking about it for several years. Now, one of our new approaches here, and we've mentioned several times harmonization, we've also mentioned sustainability impacts. So going forward, we are realigning our criteria by the 4 sustainability impacts shown here: climate change mitigation, sustainable use of resources, or also commonly referred to as circularity, reduction of chemicals of concern, and corporate, environmental, social, and governance performance. Within each of these modules, you'll recognize many topics from our current product categories. So there's a lot of the same type of criteria that we're used to. So for example, you can read the slide, but climate change is a great example where we envision criteria around embodied carbon or carbon footprint, the use of renewable energy, energy efficiency in manufacturing, product energy efficiency, as well as fluorinated greenhouse gases in manufacturing. We anticipate about 12 to 15 criteria in each module. Criteria in each impact area will likely be a combination of product and corporate or supply chain criteria. With some modules are likely to have more product-focused criteria. For example, chemicals of concern, sustainable use of resources are likely going to be more product than supply chain criteria. But other modules, for example, the corporate ESG performance, will be comprised of more corporate or supply chain criteria, just the nature of those topics. Now, importantly, each sustainability impact module will be a separate criteria development process, which will follow our dynamic criteria development process. We'll prepare a state of sustainability research report that reviews the life cycle data and identifies the major hotspots in the product life cycle and what activities, processes, materials, or components contribute to the impact. And it'll also identify best practices for reducing the impacts. The criteria will go through a voluntary consensus process, in a separate process for each of the modules, and undergo continuous maintenance as a module. The focus on the state of sustainability impact areas, we're actually hoping will allow additional engagement by subject matter experts and really help focus stakeholders on developing criteria and strategies that effectively target and reduce the impact. So the next question that comes up is, well, what are these criteria going to, how are they going to be applied to EPEAT product categories? So the new modular sustainability impact criteria will be applied across all product categories. So in the future, the criteria for each product category, as shown on the slide, will consist of criteria from the 4 sustainability impact modules, which are those common criteria applicable across all products, plus any product-specific criteria that address some unique aspects of the product. So for example, imaging equipment is the only current product category that we have that has consumables, ink or toner cartridges. Some products might have some unique energy efficiency requirements, such as the equipment found in data centers, which is very energy, require a lot of energy. And there might be some product categories that have unique chemical concerns. So when we implement the criteria in EPEAT, which we'll talk about in a few slides, the sustainability impact criteria are going to replace the existing criteria in each category. For each product category, no worries, EPEAT will compile a single list of the sustainability impact criteria applicable to the category. So similar to today, for any given product category, a manufacturer, conformity assurance body, or purchaser can download a single criteria document that will clearly outline what the criteria are that are applicable to that category. Now, one thing I really want to emphasize, and we got a lot of questions about, is when we're developing the criteria for the sustainability impacts, we don't plan to start from scratch. That is not our intention. We have many credible criteria in EPEAT that address these sustainability impacts. So we plan to build on what we have. As we've seen in the slide, there's a lot of topics and a lot of criteria that we currently have. So we plan to build on what we have and pull from or point to existing criteria, as long as they represent leadership and credibly address the sustainability impact. So we're not going to reinvent the wheel. We're going to build on what we have. Very important. So with that sort of overview of the modular aspect of the criteria that we'll be implementing going forward. So what I want to do now is to actually look further into the actual steps in the criteria development process. So this slide provides an overview of criteria development with two distinct parts that I want to call out. The first is the preparatory work, which is represented in the blue boxes, starting with our state of sustainability research, followed by criteria drafting, review, and vetting by expert ad hoc groups, and the compilation of a full criteria document. Now, these steps in the process, these blue boxes, will be overseen by GEC staff with the engagement of stakeholders. The full draft criteria document is going to be the actual starting point for the technical committee, which is the consensus body in the process. And that's represented by the green box. This process will be managed by our partner, NSF International, who has many, many years experience in managing voluntary consensus processes. Now, one of the aspects of this process we think is important is that we're pulling the criteria drafting out of the technical committee. Now, this is a major change, not an uncommon thing for criteria development, actually. And what it's intended to do is to streamline and, in fact, shorten the duration of the voluntary consensus process, which is going to allow broader stakeholder participation in the consensus body. Now, the other thing I'd like to highlight on this slide is that there are two public consultation opportunities open to all stakeholders at critical points in the criteria development process. So where are they? The first public consultation, as shown on the left, is on the state of sustainability research. The stakeholders are asked to review these reports. Again, there's going to be a separate report for each of our modules, each of our criteria development processes. And we ask stakeholders to review the reports, provide additional data, identify any gaps or inaccuracies in the analysis, and to provide their feedback, because it's critical. The state of sustainability research is the scientific basis. And will provide the direction for criteria development. So we need to make sure that we have the information in the state of sustainability research, because this is going to be used by throughout the rest of the process to identify or to draft criteria and make sure that we're addressing the impacts. Now, the second public consultation is on the full draft criteria document. And this actually occurs at the beginning of the voluntary consensus process, so that the technical committee, the consensus body, can consider the comments and modify criteria as needed in their deliberations to address public comment. So that's an overview. And then in the next couple slides, we're going to go into more detail. This slide is some detail on the initial phase of the criteria development. Now, I don't have time to go into all the specifics of each process step during this presentation, but do know that they're described in greater detail in our new criteria development policies and procedures. These will be available in the coming days. So there's much more detail available there. But to quickly go through the steps in the process, again, the state of sustainability research lays the foundation for criteria development by identifying the impacts in the life cycle and how the impacts can be mitigated, strategies for mitigation. Now, based on the state of sustainability research, GEC staff will review existing criteria and best practices within the EPEAT program and other programs and propose draft criteria that address the identified impacts. Stakeholders are also encouraged to submit draft criteria for consideration. We are, totally open, as we've done in past processes, for stakeholders to contribute their ideas for criteria. All criteria are then vetted by expert ad hoc groups, which are organized by clusters of similar criteria. So, for example, we're just about to release the State of Sustainability Research for Climate Change Mitigation. So we have some idea of what the ad hoc groups will look like. The proposed topics for expert ad hocs, no surprise: renewable energy, energy efficiency in manufacturing, product carbon footprint, product transport, product energy efficiency, somewhat parallel to the subtopics you saw on the previous slide. So then what GEC will put out a call for technical experts to participate in the expert ad hocs. We'll also solicit participants to fill any gaps. And we're really looking for participants here that are interested in really rolling up their sleeves to work on criteria. Ideally, we think 4 to 12 stakeholders with expertise on the topic and representing different stakeholder perspectives would be great. The charge of the expert ad hoc groups is to provide expert input, deliberate, and reach agreement on the approach and language of draft criteria. In situations where there's no available or insufficient draft criteria, the expert ad hocs will be asked, maybe tasked with actually drafting criteria. So that's a possibility as well, but certainly deliberating and modifying draft criteria. Now, the criteria from each of the ad hoc group are then compiled into a single draft criteria document, and this is what's submitted to the technical committee, the consensus body, for deliberation. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Jessica Evans, who will walk through the next couple of slides and talk about the role of the technical committee and consensus body. Jessica?
Great, thank you so much, Patty. So now let's walk through the path to reaching consensus. As we just heard, this dynamic criteria development process will be starting with a full draft document created by the activities that Patty has just outlined. Having this document will streamline the development process because there will be content to start the discussions and review activities, and will streamline the process overall. The technical committee will discuss the state of sustainability research document. They'll review the science-based priority impacts and mitigation strategies that have been put together based on feedback from technical experts, consideration of global standards, and even a public review component that Patty discussed, along with many other preparation activities that go into putting this document together. The technical committee will then review the draft criteria that addresses the identified impacts, with background being provided to those participants as how this criteria was developed and put together for consideration and review. They will have the opportunity to address any questions for clarity and identify any potential gaps that still need to be addressed within the criteria document. Then we'll move to the next part of the process, which will be the initial ballot of the technical committee. And this will be an opportunity to identify areas of agreement where we can move forward with, and focus primarily on the areas of disagreement in order to reach consensus. Often in the NSF process, this is referred to as a straw ballot, and it brings focus to those areas that need to be refined in order to reach consensus with participating stakeholders. It creates the opportunity to collect all of the feedback in one place in the process and bring forward recommendations for further discussion and consideration. And while this initial straw ballot or initial ballot of the technical committee is being conducted, in parallel, we will also be conducting a public comment period. And so we will be collecting the feedback from public participants as well. All of that feedback will be compiled, and over the next 6 months, the technical committee will meet to address the comments received. The feedback that is received from the technical committee as well as the public comment process will be presented in a way that it will guide the discussion and resolution process in an organized and focused fashion. There will be monthly 2-hour calls where we will discuss the areas of needing to be addressed and reach consensus. Our team at NSF will ensure that supporting materials and follow-up items are tracked very closely to support the productivity of the committee and all those that are involved. And finally, to complete the development process for the criteria, we will then issue a final ballot and comment resolution phase. So the ballot will be issued to the technical committee for approval, and then any negative votes will be reviewed and considered by the technical committee participants, in an effort to resolve them will be conducted. In the end, reaching consensus. Now I'd like to provide a little bit more detail on the makeup of the technical committee. This voluntary consensus body will be made up of a maximum of 21 voting members, and we will have the ability to utilize weighted voting if necessary, but we are anticipating reaching balance based on the membership, but have that ability to use weighted voting if necessary. It will be made up of invited technical experts, and through this process, through this committee participation, we will not be having any observers. There will be an application process similar to what we've utilized in the past, with the defined selection criteria. When we're seating the committee, the following items will be taken into consideration. Of course, we want to make sure that we have technical competency and qualification, qualified individuals at the table. We want to ensure balanced stakeholder participation across the committee, including geographic and product representation, as well as the 4 specific interest categories that I will provide additional detail on. And really looking at the size of the manufacturers from the product perspective is something that we will be focusing on as well. And one final component that we will be considering is participation in recent and concurrent processes in order to promote full engagement. We realize that this is a voluntary process, and we all have our day jobs that are competing with the work that we are going to be taking on here. So that will be taken into consideration as well, because you will see in the next couple of slides that there is an aggressive timeline and a lot of work ahead of us. So we'll be taking that into consideration with our participants. So I wanted to provide a little bit more detail on the 4 key stakeholder categories that we will be considering when seating the technical committee. First, we have the manufacturers. So the manufacturers are of products covered by the scope of the criteria and their trade associations. And then we have other industry. So these are businesses that are commercially engaged with the products, such as suppliers, recyclers, telecom and data center operators, and the trade associations in all of these particular areas. And then other types of business commercially engaged with the product as well. And then the third category is the sustainability advocates and government regulatory category. And these are individuals from a public agency, whether it be local, regional, state, federal, or international. And it represents a professional public environmental health and safety organization, or academia, or a not-for-profit environmental organization as well. And then our final And fourth category is the purchasing and eco-label criteria user category. And these are individuals whose organization purchases, uses, or specifies the products or services that are covered in the scope of the criteria in question. These user and consumers and other trade association it includes users, consumers, and other trade associations as well as institutional purchases and third-party conformity assessment organizations, testing and auditing organizations. And retailers are also included in the user membership classification as well. Now I'd like to turn it back over to Patty to give you more details on the modular criteria development timeline, and look forward to answering your questions in just a little bit.
Great, thanks so much, Jess. We valued NSF as our partner in consensus development for years now. We look forward to the continued relationship, and I hope that many of you can see that there's a lot of similarities in the process as described by Jess. Of course, there's also some modifications as well, but there's a lot of similarities in the developing consensus. So now what I'd like to talk a little bit about is first the timeline for criteria development, and then the timeline for implementation in the product categories. So first, this is the proposed timeline for developing the sustainability impact criteria. The slide is color-coded like earlier slides with the preparatory work, the state of sustainability research, criteria drafting in blue, and the voluntary consensus or technical committee in green. We're proposed stretching criteria development over 2 years to basically reduce the burden on stakeholders that may want to participate in multiple processes, but they are staggered, as you see. Now, this might seem like a lot of processes running concurrently, but I do want to remind folks that each of the sustainability impact modules is expected to be, upwards of 15 or so criteria. It's not a typical criteria development process like we've undertaken before, where we're developing the full suite of criteria, across all the categories. So these are discrete, separate processes that are, by definition, much more focused and less criteria. Now, you'll notice the final row there is the development of product-specific criteria, and this will actually commence after the criteria drafting is underway for the fourth module. And at this point, we'll have identified what the gaps are for the various product categories. Now, I will explain in a slide in a minute what the phase 1 refers to. On the next slide, I'll move into a little more detail on the specific stakeholder engagement opportunities. So again, this is just in a different format, but it is the process over 2 years. And it includes the 4 sustainability impact modules that we've been discussing. Each of those modules is a separate criteria development process, as I've previously mentioned, and each of the separate processes are represented in a different colored row in the table. Now, I do just want to point out that there is at the top, you'll notice a new product category that is, we've just begun to develop criteria for health and well-being wearable electronic devices. Now, this will leverage some of the sustainability impact criteria. I'm not going to go into detail here, but it's on this slide because it is part of the new set of criteria development under the NSF partnership. If you're interested in more information in this wearables, please let me know, and I'll get information to you. We are getting ready to form the expert ad hocs. As you'll see, the state of sustainability research and public comment actually was completed in January. Now, as I said, each of these rows in the table is a separate criteria development process. For each process, what you'll see here are the same 3 opportunities for stakeholder engagement with a timeline provided for planning purposes. Now you'll see that there's stakeholders can choose to provide participate in the state of sustainability research, public comment, drafting criteria, join an expert ad hoc, apply to be on a technical committee, and or submit public comment on the draft criteria. So just note where it says technical committee, that would be both whether you wanted to apply to be a voting member of a technical committee, or the general time frame for when we would be soliciting a public comment on the draft criteria. So now you're probably wondering, well, how do I keep informed about what's going on, of all these moving parts and opportunities for engagement? So GEC, we have three principal ways that stakeholders can stay up to date on criteria development. Now, first, in the middle there is our GEC newsletters. Many of you probably already received the newsletter. That might be how you learned about this webinar today. The newsletters go out every 2 weeks, provide announcements on various activities within GEC and EPEAT, webinars, open public comment periods, perhaps EPEAT registry changes, etc. So going forward, we will continue to include in the GEC newsletter all criteria development announcements. But in addition, we have heard from stakeholders that they want additional communication mechanisms to stay apprised of EPEAT criteria development, particularly as we are now, having additional engagement opportunities for stakeholders. So we are actually launching 2 additional communication tools. First is the EPEAT announcements webpage. It can be found at the URL on the screen, and this page actually went live this morning. So it is brand new, launching in conjunction with this public webinar. And this web page will include all open stakeholder engagement opportunities, and it'll include criteria development announcements, but also other announcements for the EPEAT program, and will allow you to check in to see what's happening at your convenience. If you go to the page, you'll see right now you'll see a call for participation in expert ad hocs for the health and well-being wearables product category. We're also creating a feature on the EPEAT announcement webpage that will allow you to register as a stakeholder and receive EPEAT announcements directly by electronic mail. So that's another way so that when EPEAT announcements come out, which would be similar to the GEC newsletter, but it will come directly to your inbox as a separate announcement. So finally, I want to leave some time for questions and answers. So the final topic, and I know a topic that's very important to our stakeholders, and that is how GEC plans to implement the sustainability impact criteria in EPEAT. Before I share the actual timeline, I want to share some of the rationale behind the implementation plan. So 3 things. First, we want to allow participating manufacturers 12 months to transition to the revised criteria to better accommodate design and production cycles. Now, in the past, we've allotted just 6 to 9 months, but we understand that this is, this is a significant change, and we want to allow more time. We're also, in the implementation, we're going to apply all revised criteria, all the sustainability impact criteria at the same time. We've heard that a simultaneous rollout is considered more efficient for cabs and manufacturers than if we were to stagger the rollout of revised criteria. So simultaneous rollout of the 4 modules rather than swapping out criteria for climate change and then chemicals, et cetera. So simultaneous rollout. And then the third is that we are going to limit the initial application of the sustainability impact modules to product categories launched prior to 2020. And this is really in keeping with GEC's 3-year criteria review cycle and implementation of major revisions. So I'll say which categories there are on the next slide. So based on those considerations, here's the timeline. In phase 1, we'll simultaneously, again, apply all 4 sustainability impact modules and any product-specific criteria across EPEAT categories that launched prior to 2020. So this would include computers and displays, imaging equipment, mobile phones, servers, and televisions. Phase 2 will cover EPEAT categories launched in or after 2020. That would be photovoltaics, network equipment, and wearables, which is actually under development. The graphic just provides the calendar for phase 1. So as shown on the previous category development timeline, all criteria will be published by December 2022. EPEAT will then spend the first several months of 2023 completing the registry build out and developing training materials, although they can start those processes earlier as criteria are finalized. The public registry would launch in May 2023, allow a 12-month transition, as I mentioned before, transition from the old criteria to the new criteria. And similarly to past, there would be a registry for old criteria and then a registry for conforming to the new criteria. And then by April 30, 2024, the transition to the new criteria for all phase 1 products would be complete, and the old registry would go away. And moving forward, May 1, 2024 and beyond, it'll just be the new revised criteria for each product category in phase 1. Now, there would be a similar timeline to this that would be applied to phase 2 products in 2024. So that is the plans for the timeline and implementation of the criteria development, as well as implementing it within EPEAT. And that actually completes the presentation for today. So what I'd like to do is to turn to some questions. And we've already received some. And so why don't we start with some of the questions that we've received. So I'm going to try to manage this whole thing. So first, we've had several questions about the process and its alignment with the U.S. federal government requirements for voluntary consensus and ISO 1424, which is the standard for type 1 ecolabels. So let's take them one at a time. So let's see, a question: how does the process in general and developing criteria by sustainability impact modules meet the U.S. federal government requirements for voluntary consensus standards? So ONB, and I actually have a slide I can share on this. Because this question often comes up. So ONB Circular A119, many of you might be familiar with it, provides guidance to federal purchasers on the use of standards in procurement. And basically it says that federal agencies must use voluntary consensus standards in lieu of government unique standards in procurement and regulatory activities. So this is what you see on the screen in this slide is how the ONB Circular defines voluntary consensus standard. And the process, and it's really about the process in which the standard is developed. It has to meet these 5 elements of voluntary consensus, which are openness, balance, due process, appeals process, and consensus. And the ONB Circular broadly defines standards, and it can include a variety of documents rules, guidelines, etc. And GEC, we've actually consulted with NIST, who issues the OMB circular, and we've confirmed that for the purposes of federal procurement, a standard does not have to be a single voluntary consensus document, nor does it actually have to be an American national standard to meet the federal requirements for voluntary consensus. Now, an American national standard is one path, but it's not required. So the GEC, our new process does meet the elements of voluntary consensus, and each sustainability impact module in itself would meet that definition as well. And it's okay if you build a product category based on multiple modules. So that's the first part. Now, I have some other questions here, but I want to actually put this one to Jessica, a question for you. And it builds on the whole voluntary consensus, and that is, how is this process comparable to the ANSI process that has been used, to date for the criteria used in the EPEAT program?
This is a great question that we've gotten outside of this process and within this new process as well. So actually, NSF has experience leading criteria development. Within the ANSI process, we are up to 85 published American national standards, but also we have about 60 criteria documents to date that have followed a similar process that we've laid out today over the past several years in many different product categories. So, the approach that we laid out, where there's content in a document that's provided to the committee for participants to work with, is something that we've utilized in the past. Open discussion with a balanced committee of stakeholders to reach consensus is a key component. And then the final balloting of the committee for approval with that 2/3 approval threshold and the public comment opportunity as well. We believe that there are fundamental components within this process that directly align with the ANSI accredited standards development process that we utilize for our American national standards as well. There are just a few slight modifications, including the biggest, which is limiting the size of the committee. So.
Great. Well, thanks, Jess. Yeah, I mean, it's, as we've noted, that an American national standard is one path. Maybe it could be the easy button, but there are other ways to achieve voluntary consensus that is used by many organizations. So thank you for that. Let's actually, Nancy, a question for you. How does this approach that is being taken to develop the EPEAT criteria, how does this align with GEC's mission?
That's a really good question, and I appreciate it being asked during this webinar. So as I mentioned, the Global Electronics Council, we're really overarchingly looking to create a more sustainable and just world. And from that perspective, we think that we really need to bring to the table a good cross-section of representative voices. And I think, Patty, you and Jess did a great job in pointing out that some of the prior inhibitors to making sure that voices from non-North America, as well as voices from smaller organizations, be they businesses or academic or advocacy organizations, really were challenged with our past processes. And so one of the major advantages I see for us having developed the dynamic criteria development process, and then, of course, partnering with NSF International in its implementation, is that we're really paying off on bringing inclusive voices to this process, making sure that really the EPEAT Ecolabel is representative of global insights and interests, and that it therefore best meets the increasing global adoption that this eco-label is having. And of course, we're very proud within the Global Electronics Council that EPEAT has seen considerable adoption, not only, of course, continuing within the United States, but in Canada, and as you mentioned, in North and Central and South America, as well as in the EU, more emphasis on being a Type 1 eco-label, and of course, increasingly in Asian countries as well. So I think it's a great question, and I'm really thankful for the ability to put this new process in place, and of course, couldn't have done it without NSF International.
Great, thank you very much, Nancy. So we have some more specific questions that get to again some of the issues of openness and transparency, et cetera. And one, I guess, combining a few questions here is, and I hope we've addressed this in our presentation, but we'll look at it again because it has come in. And the question is, how is the entire process open to all interested parties to meet federal requirements and also some of the requirements of ISO 1424? And how are we going to ensure transparency through all stages of the development and operation of the criteria development process? So I think I'll take a stab at that because there are some references not only to voluntary consensus, but to the ISO 1424 process. And as I hope many of participants know that GEC is a accredited organization for the ISO 1424 Type 1 Ecolabel. So we've actually been audited and have demonstrated that we meet the requirements of ISO 1424. So that's actually a great achievement and one in which really puts us right up there as a Type 1 Ecolabel in the global environment. So again, I still have the slide on the screen here about voluntary consensus. So there's been reference both to the federal requirements as well as ISO. So what I just want to mention is that openness, for example, and transparency is in part really defined in two different ways. And one is about the transparency and availability of your policies and procedures, how you are actually developing the criteria. And to this end, as I mentioned, GEC does have policies and procedures that will govern the entire process. And I'll actually, in a minute, let Jess speak to that they also have policies and procedures that will specifically address the consensus process. So that's one way. That's one way for openness. The second thing about openness is really about allowing meaningful participation in the process by stakeholders. And I'll actually can bring back up this slide here. But as we've mentioned before, there's public consultation processes at critical points in the process, and the engagement and welcoming of stakeholders to participate in criteria development or to join the technical committee as a voting member of the consensus body. So there's lots of opportunities for participation, and ISO 1424 basically says, hey, you need to let interested parties review and comment and give them adequate time. And that's in fact what they're talking about, transparency. So all of those are built in to the process that we've devised. We've devised our policies and procedures to align with both voluntary consensus as well as ISO 1424. And Jess, in the few minutes remaining, can you just quickly touch on that there's separate policies and procedures for the consensus body?
Yes, great. Thank you, Patty. So there will be a separate set of policies and procedures. And as Patty mentioned, with GEC being audited, NSF is audited from a number of different entities as well. So it will be treated, the rigor to adhere to these policies it will be something that will be built in our infrastructure within our team. Our policies and procedures will be available in mid-April. They will be posted on the GEC site as well as the NSF online workspace, and then of course provided to anyone that requests them directly. There's really some key components in the policies and procedures. So the makeup of the committee, the 4 stakeholders that I had outlined in my overview earlier, and then allowing, although our goal is to reach that equal representation across all 4 stakeholders, we will have the ability to utilize that weighted voting. I just want to mention that again, if necessary. And that voting component, so 2/3 approval from the technical committee members is something that is key in reaching consensus, as well as the consideration and effort to resolve those negative votes will be documented and recorded. And then finally, the process for appeals is outlined in these NSF specific policies and procedures.
Great. Well, thank you. And all of this information, will be available, on the GEC and EPEAT website for, folks to access. But for now, we're at the top of the hour, and I want to thank you for joining the webinar today. Thanks, Nancy and Jessica, for joining me as well. And a reminder that a recording of the webinar will be available following the call and posted on our website. And please visit the EPEAT announcements webpage on the screen again here to see our current and future announcements. So with that, thank you very much, and I really look forward to your engagement in future criteria development for the EPEAT program. Bye now.